He left her during the wedding for his ex-girlfriend. Years later, the truth came out and shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're from. The morning of her wedding, Riley awoke before the sun. The faint glow creeping through the heavy hotel curtains painted soft lines across the ceiling, and for a moment she lay still, letting the reality of the day sink into her bones. She had dreamt of this morning countless times, yet none of those dreams could capture the weight, the quiet electricity humming beneath her skin. Today, she would marry Nicholas. Her mother's gentle knock broke the silence, followed by the sound of her voice, low and tender, like it had been when Riley was a child and too afraid to sleep after a nightmare. "Baby, it's time." The suite was soon filled with the soft rustle of fabric and hushed laughter. Riley's closest friends and family moved around her, carefully orchestrating the dance of preparation. Her best friend, Tamara, adjusted her veil with meticulous care while her mother clasped the simple gold bracelet around her wrist, the one her grandmother had worn on her own wedding day. Despite the hum of conversation, Riley felt a hollow pit quietly forming in her chest. It wasn't nerves, not exactly. She trusted Nicholas. They had spent years together, building something that felt sturdy, real, worthy of this moment. But there was an undercurrent she couldn't quite place, a flicker of doubt that wasn't about him but about whether she was allowed to be this happy. Her mother caught her eye in the mirror, reading her daughter's thoughts the way only mothers can. "You deserve this, Riley," she said softly. "Don't let anyone make you question that." Riley smiled, though the knot in her stomach remained. She told herself it was just the enormity of the day pressing down on her. The ceremony was set in an elegant hall draped in ivory and soft blush hues, a reflection of Nicholas's taste and Riley's minimalist elegance. Friends, family, colleagues, and more than a few people whose names Riley didn't know filled the space, murmuring and laughing in the low, reverent tones of wedding guests who have dressed carefully and arrived early. She stood at the entrance of the hall, arm looped through her father's, staring down the aisle at Nicholas. He looked devastatingly handsome in his tailored navy suit, his expression soft and almost reverent as his gaze locked on her. The moment their eyes met, the rest of the room fell away. It had always been that way with him. Her steps felt lighter than air as she moved toward him, past the rows of expectant faces, the disapproving glances of some of Nicholas's relatives who had never fully masked their discomfort with the woman he had chosen. Riley kept her eyes on him, clinging to the warmth in his smile like a lifeline. Their vows were exchanged under a delicate arch woven with pale roses and greenery. Riley's voice trembled only once, when she promised to love Nicholas without conditions, without fear, forever. His vows were steady, his words chosen with care. He spoke of the life they had built, of how she had made him braver, softer, stronger. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Nicholas kissed her as though the world had disappeared. The reception unfolded like something out of a dream. Candlelit tables, clinking glasses, heartfelt speeches. Tamara stood and toasted Riley's resilience, her capacity to love even when the world hadn't always loved her back. Nicholas's best man, a childhood friend named Colin, joked about how Nicholas had stopped working weekends once Riley entered his life, how he'd changed in ways that only love could explain. Their first dance was to an old Sam Cooke song Riley's father used to play in the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Nicholas had chosen it, quietly, knowing how much it would mean to her. He held her close, whispering in her ear, making her laugh despite the lump forming in her throat. For a moment, Riley believed in the fairy tale. That moment didn't last. It happened quietly at first, the way storms begin with a single drop of rain. She had been speaking to Tamara mid-laugh when her eyes flicked across the room and landed on Nicholas. He was standing near the bar, phone in hand, expression unreadable. She almost didn't notice, the swirl of conversation and music pulling her attention elsewhere, but something in the way his posture shifted, in the way his shoulders folded inward, made her pause. He read the message once, then again, his face draining of color with each pass. Riley's laughter faltered. She excused herself and began weaving through the crowd, her pulse pounding in her ears. Guests clinked glasses, oblivious as she moved toward him. Before she reached him, Nicholas's eyes lifted, meeting hers. And, in that instant, something in her chest broke. He mouthed something she couldn't quite hear over the music. She thought it was her name. Then he turned and walked away. At first, Riley hesitated. Surely he'd be back in a moment. Maybe a family emergency, something urgent but explainable. She lingered near the bar, eyes scanning the doorway, willing him to return. Minutes passed. Guests began to murmur, glancing toward her, toward the empty space beside her at the head table. Tamara appeared at her side, concern etched deep in her face. "Where's Nicholas?" she asked. Riley didn't have an answer. 15 minutes became 30. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, confusion rippling like a wave. Tamara left to check the hallway, the lobby, the parking lot. She returned empty-handed. The truth settled like a stone in Riley's stomach. Cold, heavy, unmoving. Nicholas wasn't coming back. Her mother tried to pull her aside. Her father asked questions she couldn't answer. Colin, the best man, stammered something about Nicholas being overwhelmed, but Riley could see in his eyes that he knew no more than she did. The music played on, absurd in its cheerfulness. Waiters circled with champagne flutes no one wanted. Someone suggested calling off the rest of the evening quietly, without making a scene. As if the absence of the groom at his own wedding could ever be anything but a scene. Riley stood frozen in the center of it all, her wedding dress too heavy on her shoulders, her hands trembling around the stem of a glass she hadn't realized she was holding. It slipped from her fingers. The crash echoed across the marble floor, sharp and jarring. Heads turned, conversations halted. But Riley didn't move. The world around her blurred, the concerned faces of friends, the whispers, the glances exchanged like secrets. The only thing clear was the hollow space beside her, the absence of the man who had promised to stand there. By the time the guests began to leave, one by one, murmuring apologies and confusion, Riley remained in the middle of the room, staring at the door through which Nicholas had disappeared. Tamara wrapped an arm around her shoulders, leading her gently away, but Riley's legs felt numb, her mind suspended in that moment of shattering glass and breaking promises. Later that night, in the sterile quiet of the hotel suite, she sat on the edge of the bed, her wedding dress pooled around her like a discarded costume. The phone rang endlessly. Friends, family, reporters, but she let it ring, staring at the empty space where Nicholas should have been. She thought of the vows he had spoken that afternoon, the look in his eyes when he had promised her forever. And she wondered, with a hollow ache in her chest, how forever had become a single day. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the ruin of her happiest day. Inside, Riley sat alone, waiting for an explanation that would never come. The hours following the collapse of Riley's wedding felt like a blur, an endless, disjointed reel of hushed voices, concerned faces, and the echo of glass shattering against marble. She barely remembered how she had ended up back at her apartment, still in her wedding dress, the weight of it pressing against her shoulders like a burden she couldn't shed. Tamara had stayed with her that night, fussing quietly around her, making tea she never drank, whispering soft reassurances that Riley couldn't hear. But when the sun rose the next morning, Tamara was gone, leaving behind the cold silence of Riley's empty apartment and the hundreds of missed calls and messages lighting up her phone like a funeral pyre. Her mother had called 27 times. Her father, 6. Colin, Nicholas's best man, had left voicemail after voicemail, his voice heavy with something between confusion and shame. Friends, colleagues, distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted an answer, and Riley had none. The headlines started the next day. First in local society blogs, then larger outlets, each one more intrusive and callous than the last. Runaway groom, the wedding that ended before it began. Social worker left at altar by wealthy architect fiancé. Nicholas Weston's disappearing act, love, lies, and a wedding scandal. Riley refused to read the articles, but the headlines were enough. She couldn't escape them. They were there when she turned on her phone, when she opened her laptop, even when she tried to walk down the street to buy groceries, the photos following her like shadows. There she was, captured in full color, standing alone in the grand reception hall, her dress immaculate, her face hollow. The whispers followed her everywhere. She heard them at the corner store, in the hallway outside her apartment, on the subway. Some people expressed pity, others thinly veiled delight in the scandal. But the worst were the ones who speculated, who filled in the blanks of her silence with their own assumptions. She must have done something. Maybe he found out something about her. She probably wasn't what she seemed. Riley stopped leaving her apartment altogether. The texts from Tamara grew more worried, more insistent. Her mother called every day, her voicemails growing shorter, sharper, tinged with frustration and fear. Her father offered to come stay with her, but Riley ignored them all. She didn't have the strength to explain what she herself couldn't comprehend. Then came the phone call that broke through the fog. It was late, long past midnight, when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but something about the number, unknown, unlisted, drew her hand to the screen. When she picked up, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar but authoritative. "Miss Riley Bennett?" "Yes." "This is Detective Simon Harris with the Boston Police Department. I'm calling regarding an anonymous complaint filed against you." Riley's blood turned to ice. She sat motionless as the detective explained, his tone careful, professional. Someone had submitted an official complaint alleging misconduct in her work with underage clients, claims of coercion, inappropriate relationships, financial manipulation. The complaint was detailed, specific, and disturbingly thorough. "We're obligated to open a preliminary investigation," the detective said. "At this stage, it's procedural. You'll be contacted by the department's internal review board within the week." Riley barely heard the rest of the call. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossibility of it. She had worked tirelessly for years as a social worker, often at the expense of her own well-being. She had dedicated herself to protecting vulnerable children, to fighting for those who had no one else. And now someone was trying to destroy that. The following days unfolded like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. The official notice arrived by certified mail, summoning her to a meeting with the review board. A suspension followed soon after, pending investigation. The whispers intensified. Now, people had a reason to believe the worst. Riley's mother showed up at her door unannounced one afternoon, her face tight with concern. She stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, taking in the darkened living room, the unopened wedding gifts still stacked in the corner, the discarded bouquet wilting in a vase. "You can't hide like this, baby," her mother said gently, brushing a hand over Riley's shoulder. Riley wanted to scream, to tell her that hiding was all she could do, that stepping outside meant facing the weight of public humiliation, professional ruin, and the gaping wound Nicholas had left in his wake. But she didn't have the words. The investigation dragged on, weeks bleeding into months. Riley's lawyer assured her the claims were fabricated, that there was no evidence to substantiate them, but the damage was already done. Her reputation was in tatters. The board eventually cleared her, citing lack of evidence and malicious intent behind the complaint, but it felt hollow. The stain remained. Somewhere along the way, Riley stopped answering the phone altogether. Tamara stopped by less frequently, her visits marked by worried glances and awkward silences. Riley's parents returned to their lives, her father's health declining, her mother's voice on the phone growing thinner, more fragile. And through it all, Nicholas remained silent. The tabloids had moved on to other scandals, but Riley still saw him sometimes, his face flashing across a news segment, a photograph in the society pages. He had returned to the orbit of Catherine Ellison, the woman he'd dated before Riley, the daughter of one of the city's wealthiest developers. The headlines painted them as rekindled lovers, destined to be together after all. Riley stopped reading them. The days folded into themselves, indistinguishable and gray. She ate when she remembered to, slept when her body gave out. The spark that had once driven her, her passion, her empathy, her belief in people, flickered and dimmed until only embers remained. It was Tamara who finally forced her out of the apartment. She showed up one Saturday morning, armed with coffee and an ultimatum. "You're coming with me," Tamara said, her voice brooking no argument. "You've been drowning for months, and I'm not going to let you sink." Riley didn't have the energy to protest. Tamara drove them to the waterfront, to the same cafe they had frequented during their college years. The smell of fresh coffee, the chatter of strangers, the crisp salt air. Riley felt like she was breathing for the first time in months. They sat in silence for a long time, sipping their drinks. "You didn't deserve what he did to you," Tamara said finally, her voice low but firm. "And you don't deserve to waste the rest of your life punishing yourself for it." Riley swallowed hard, her throat burning. "I don't know how to start over," she whispered. "You don't have to know," Tamara replied. "You just have to decide you want to." That night, Riley stood in her living room and packed away the wedding dress. She folded it carefully, sealing it in a box she shoved to the back of her closet. She deleted the saved photos from her phone, the headlines, the articles. She let herself cry until she couldn't anymore. And then, when the tears dried, she sat down and opened her laptop. The world hadn't ended, even if it had felt like it had. And if it hadn't ended, that meant she could begin again. The void in her chest remained, but she was learning how to live around it. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. One small breath at a time, Riley began the long, slow process of reclaiming herself. The years that followed the implosion of Riley's wedding passed not in a blur, but in something heavier, something denser, like trying to wade through molasses. The world did not stop for her grief, her humiliation, her loss. It continued spinning indifferently while she fought every day to remember how to stand, how to breathe, how to move without feeling like she was dragging a phantom limb behind her. Grief had not killed her, but it had hollowed her out. After the investigation against her was officially closed and her name cleared, Riley didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired. The relief was shallow, a cool cloth on a wound that went too deep to heal with simple words or formal letters. She returned to work eventually, not because she felt ready, but because she needed something to tether her, something to keep her from sinking entirely. It wasn't the same, though. She was not the same. The once bright-eyed, relentless advocate who had fought fiercely for every child, every woman who walked through the doors of the social center, had been replaced by someone colder, more cautious, someone who knew firsthand how fragile the foundation of a life could be. People still whispered when she walked into meetings. Some looked away. Others offered smiles too sympathetic, too pitying. Riley met them all with the same polite mask, the same detached professionalism. She did her job well, efficiently, but never let anyone close enough to see how broken she still felt inside. It was during that time, when she had learned how to function without truly living, that the idea for the foundation took shape. It had started as a whisper in the back of her mind, something to do with all the anger and hurt that had nowhere to go. She realized she wanted to create something that could not be taken from her, something that couldn't collapse in an instant the way her life had. A place for women and children who had been lied to, betrayed, manipulated, discarded. A place for people like her. It took nearly 2 years, hundreds of meetings, late nights spent drafting proposals and chasing donors, but eventually, the Bennett Foundation for Empowerment and Support opened its doors. The grand opening was modest, no media presence, no champagne, but Riley had stood in front of the small gathering of staff, volunteers, and a few supporters, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. She poured her heart into the foundation, and in return, it gave her structure, purpose, and something resembling peace. And yet, even as she built something real and good, her personal life remained empty, a carefully guarded fortress. She smiled when people asked if she was dating again, brushed off questions from well-meaning friends who wanted her to move on. Tamara had long since stopped trying to set her up with anyone, understanding better than most that Riley wasn't ready, or perhaps never would be. Years slipped by in this quiet rhythm, days stitched together by work, occasional dinners with Tamara, phone calls from her aging parents, and nights spent alone with a book or the quiet hum of the television. The void inside her had become familiar, something she had learned to live around. It wasn't until the day Daniel and his son walked into her office that she realized how much space she had left empty. It had been a typical Thursday, the kind that blurred into the ones before and after. Riley had been reviewing case files when her assistant buzzed her. "There's a man here asking to speak with you directly. Says it's about his son." Riley sighed, already preparing her professional smile. "Send him in." The door opened to reveal a man in his late 30s, tall and quietly handsome, with a weariness in his eyes she recognized instantly. Beside him stood a boy, maybe 10 or 11, awkward and quiet, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Miss Bennett?" the man asked. Riley nodded, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. "Please, sit. And you are?" "Daniel Carter," he said, offering his hand. "This is my son, Marcus." As they sat, Riley studied them carefully. Daniel's posture was protective, but there was no aggression in his gaze, only exhaustion and a trace of vulnerability he was trying to hide. "What brings you here, Mr. Carter?" Daniel explained that he was a single father. His wife had passed away 3 years prior after a long battle with cancer. Since then, Marcus had been struggling. Behavioral issues, trouble at school, angry outbursts. Daniel had tried therapy, counseling, everything he could think of, but nothing had seemed to reach his son. "I heard about your foundation," he said quietly. "A friend of mine said you help families like mine." Riley listened, nodding, her heart tightening a little at the rawness in his voice. She had heard hundreds of stories like his, but each one still landed in her chest like a stone. They talked for nearly an hour. Marcus said little, his eyes darting around the room but rarely meeting hers. Daniel spoke candidly about the challenges of being both mother and father, about the guilt that weighed on him, about the fear of failing his son. Riley offered them resources, scheduled follow-up appointments, connected them with one of the counselors who worked with the foundation. It should have been like any other intake meeting, another family she could try to help and then send on their way. But when they left, she couldn't stop thinking about them. They returned the following week, then the week after. Slowly, Marcus began to thaw under the gentle care of the counselors. Daniel, too, started to linger after sessions, asking questions, offering to volunteer when he could. The conversations between Riley and Daniel started out professional. Updates on Marcus's progress, discussions about program logistics, but over time they shifted. He asked about her, about why she had started the foundation. She offered him the sanitized version at first, the public story, but eventually she let slip pieces of the truth. They talked about grief, about loss, about how hard it was to keep going when everything felt broken. There was something about Daniel that disarmed her. He wasn't trying to fix her or save her. He simply saw her, in a way few people had since that awful day years ago. Their friendship unfolded slowly, like pages of a book carefully turned. It was safe, uncomplicated. He made her laugh when she didn't expect to. He listened without judgment. He never asked for more than she could give. It was Tamara, of course, who saw it first. "You like him," she said one night over drinks, her eyes sharp despite the wine. Riley rolled her eyes. "He's a friend." Tamara arched a brow. "Uh-huh." It took Riley nearly a year to admit that Tamara was right. The first time Daniel asked her to dinner, outside of foundation events, outside of anything related to Marcus, Riley almost said no. The idea of letting someone in again terrified her, but she said yes. Their relationship unfolded gently, without the whirlwind intensity that had defined her time with Nicholas. Daniel never made grand declarations, never pushed. He simply showed up consistently, quietly, until she realized she had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. The day he introduced her to his son as someone very important to him, Riley felt something in her chest crack open. It wasn't perfect. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched when people mentioned Nicholas's name in passing. But the walls she had built around herself were no longer impenetrable. When Daniel proposed, it wasn't with a grand gesture or public display. It was a quiet evening at home, Marcus asleep in the next room, Riley curled up beside him on the couch. "I know you're scared," he had said, his voice steady, "and I don't need an answer tonight. But I love you. I want to build a life with you." It took her weeks to say yes. When she finally did, it wasn't with breathless excitement or fairy tale promises. It was with something deeper, an understanding of how fragile love could be, how easily it could be lost, and how much courage it took to choose it anyway. And yet, even as she began planning this new chapter, the shadows of her past lingered. Some nights, she still woke with the weight of memory pressing against her ribs. She told herself she had left that old life behind. But the past, as she would soon learn, had a way of finding its way back to you, whether you wanted it to or not. Spring arrived quietly that year, without fanfare, sliding into the edges of Riley's life like a song she hadn't heard in years, but somehow still knew the words too. The winter had thawed, both outside and inside her, though she scarcely noticed at first. It wasn't until one evening in late March, when she found herself laughing uncontrollably at something Daniel's son, Marcus, had said over dinner, that she realized how long it had been since laughter had felt effortless. Since her heart had felt light, her life had found a new rhythm. She had grown accustomed to the quiet hum of it, the gentle mornings spent with Daniel, the evenings where she helped Marcus with his homework, the weekends spent together in the park or at foundation events where Riley now spoke not only as an advocate but as someone who had clawed her way back from the edge. She no longer checked for Nicholas's name in headlines. It had been years since she'd searched for him in a crowd. The scar remained, but it no longer ached. The wedding plans, when they finally began, were nothing like the whirlwind of her first attempt. There were no grand ballrooms, no long guest lists carefully curated to impress. Riley and Daniel had chosen something small and intimate, a ceremony in a friend's garden, a dinner afterward with only those people who mattered. No photographers, no headlines, just them, and the life they had built piece by piece. For months, the preparations had been smooth, joyful even, until the day the letter arrived. It came on an unassuming Tuesday afternoon, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope without a return address. Riley nearly discarded it with the rest of the mail: bills, charity appeals, a bridal boutique flyer she hadn't asked for. It was only when she glanced at the handwriting that her breath caught in her throat. Her name, written in careful, familiar script: Riley Bennett. The letters blurred slightly as she stared at them. For a long moment, she stood frozen in her kitchen, the envelope pinched between her fingers like it was something that might detonate. She knew that handwriting, knew it better than she wanted to. The envelope remained unopened on her counter for 2 days. She walked past it, cleaned around it, stared at it over cups of coffee she couldn't finish. Daniel noticed her distraction but didn't press, sensing in her the weight of something old and unspoken. On the third night, when sleep refused to come and her heart felt like it might claw its way out of her chest, she opened it. The letter was brief. No salutation, no sign-off. Just a simple, devastating message written in Nicholas's unmistakable hand. I'm dying. I would like to see you one last time. There are things you don't know, things I should have told you long ago. If you are willing, please come. Below that, an address for a hospice facility not far from where they had once lived. Riley sat at the kitchen table long after she finished reading, the letter spread out before her like a crime scene. She read it again and again, searching for some hidden meaning, some proof that it wasn't real. But it was real. The words etched themselves into her brain, dredging up memories she had buried so deep she had convinced herself they no longer existed. For the first time in years, she dreamed of him that night. The dream was cruel in its simplicity. She stood in the old reception hall, the one from their wedding day, surrounded by the murmur of guests and the clinking of glasses. She wore the dress she had long since packed away, the train dragging behind her like an anchor. And there he was, Nicholas, standing at the far end of the room, looking at her with that same hollow expression he'd worn before he disappeared. When she reached him in the dream, he said nothing, just handed her a letter and turned away. Riley woke with her heart pounding, the sheets tangled around her legs. She told herself she wouldn't go. She told herself she had nothing left to say to him. But the letter stayed on her nightstand. Days passed, the weight of it growing heavier. Daniel noticed the change in her, the way her smiles no longer quite reached her eyes, the way her mind wandered when she thought no one was looking. One evening, as they sat together folding wedding invitations, he finally asked, "Are you all right?" She wanted to lie, to tell him she was just tired, that the wedding planning was overwhelming her. But when she looked up and met his eyes, the words stuck in her throat. "I got a letter," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel waited, giving her space. It was from Nicholas. His expression didn't change, but she felt something in the air between them shift. "He's dying," she added quietly. "He wants to see me." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the only sound the steady tick of the clock on the wall. "You don't owe him anything," Daniel said gently. Riley nodded, but her chest felt tight, the pressure building with every beat of her heart. "I know." That night, she lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of his breathing. She thought of all the things Nicholas had taken from her, the years she'd spent putting herself back together, the friendship strained, the trust shattered. And yet, a question remained, lodged like a splinter in her heart. What if there was something she didn't know? What if she needed to hear it just once before she could fully let go? The next morning, she made the decision. She didn't tell Daniel until after breakfast, when Marcus had already left for school. "I need to see him," she said quietly, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "I don't know why, but I do." Daniel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Then do it," he said simply. "Whatever you need to make peace." Riley drove to the hospice alone. The facility sat on the edge of the city, tucked behind a row of old trees, quiet and unassuming. The receptionist gave her a sympathetic smile when she arrived, leading her down a long corridor to a small private room at the end. Nicholas lay in the bed, thinner than she remembered, his skin pale, eyes closed. The years had hollowed him out, stripped away the man she had once loved until all that remained was this fragile shell. For a moment, she stood in the doorway, unsure if she could step inside. Then his eyes opened, and he saw her. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just watched her as she crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed. Neither of them spoke at first. The air between them was heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Nicholas broke the silence. "Thank you for coming." Riley swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Why did you ask me here?" He closed his eyes for a long moment, as if gathering what little strength he had left. "There's something you need to know," he said finally, "about that day." Her heart clenched, old wounds tearing open. He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. "I didn't leave you because I stopped loving you," he whispered. "I left because I thought I was protecting you." Riley's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Nicholas exhaled slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water on the bedside table. His voice was thin, but each word landed like a stone. "It wasn't supposed to be like that. Catherine, she came to me that day. She told me she was pregnant. She threatened to destroy everything if I didn't leave you." Riley stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "She said she'd tell everyone terrible things about you, things that could ruin your career. She had documents, messages, lies, but convincing, enough to make people believe. My family, they believed her. They begged me to leave you, to fix things before it got worse." He paused, his eyes shimmering with something dangerously close to regret. "I thought I was protecting you." Riley couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in around her, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. All this time, she had believed he had simply walked away, that she hadn't been enough, that she had been disposable. But the truth was far messier, more devastating. "You never said anything," she whispered. "You just left." "I thought it was the only way," he said quietly. "I thought if I disappeared, she would stop." He glanced down at his hands, frail and trembling. "I was wrong." Riley stood abruptly, the room spinning around her. "I need to go." Nicholas didn't stop her. He only nodded, his gaze heavy with something that looked like surrender. Outside, the spring air felt sharp against her skin, cutting through the haze in her mind. She had come for answers. Now that she had them, she wasn't sure she could bear the weight of the truth. The spring air stung Riley's cheeks as she stepped out of the hospice facility, the bright sunlight at odds with the weight pressing against her chest. She stood on the steps for a long moment, unable to move, her heart beating too loudly in her ears. The conversation she had just walked away from echoed over and over in her mind, each word like a shard of glass scraping against old wounds. She had gone there expecting to hear something selfish, something easy to hate. Instead, Nicholas's confession had hollowed her out all over again. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had built a life, brick by careful brick, around the certainty that he had left because he did not love her. She had spent years stitching her heart back together under that truth. And now, in one breath, he had unraveled everything. Riley made it to her car, sliding into the driver's seat on autopilot. She stared at the steering wheel, her fingers curled tightly around it, and let herself feel the shaking start in her hands, then her arms, until her whole body trembled. The realization of what Nicholas had said settled inside her like a stone too heavy to carry. Catherine. The threats, the lies, the deliberate sabotage of everything Riley had worked for. Her mind replayed that day at the wedding, the way he had looked at her from across the room, the way he had vanished without a word, the way her entire world had collapsed around her. And now she understood. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had run because he thought he was saving her, but he hadn't saved her. He had broken her. Riley wasn't sure how long she sat there, the sounds of the city fading into a low, distant hum. The questions circled relentlessly in her mind. How much of what he had told her was true? Had he truly believed that leaving her was the only option, or was that just another excuse to absolve himself before he died? The voice inside her, the one she had spent years learning to ignore, whispered cruelly, "If he had loved you enough, he would have fought for you." When she finally started the car and pulled away from the hospice, she didn't go home. She drove without thinking, letting muscle memory guide her through the streets of the city until she found herself outside Tamara's apartment. Her best friend answered the door in sweatpants, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a frown creasing her brow the moment she saw Riley's face. "What happened?" Tamara asked immediately, stepping aside to let her in. Riley moved like someone underwater, her body heavy, her thoughts sluggish and sharp all at once. She sat down on the worn couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He told me," she said quietly. "Nicholas." Tamara's face softened with concern. "What did he say?" The words felt foreign in her mouth, as if speaking them would make them real in a way they hadn't been before. She told Tamara everything: the letter, the visit, the confession, every lie, every threat, every choice that had led to the destruction of her life. When she finished, Tamara sat in stunned silence, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He never told you," Tamara said finally. "All these years. He let you think he just left." Riley nodded, her throat tight. "That bastard," Tamara muttered under her breath. But the anger Riley had expected to feel wasn't there. She felt hollow, like the ground beneath her feet had been ripped away. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "You don't have to do anything," Tamara said gently. "You don't owe him anything." Riley wanted to believe that. She wanted to close the door on this, to return to her life with Daniel and Marcus and the foundation she had built. But the truth hung over her like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. Later that night, when she returned home, Daniel was waiting for her. She found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his expression calm but watchful. Marcus was already asleep. Riley hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to begin. "I went to see him," she said finally. Daniel nodded once, his gaze steady, and she sat across from him, her hands folded tightly together, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. "He told me why he left." Daniel waited patiently, giving her space to speak. She told him everything, her voice breaking only once when she spoke of the threats against her, the lies that had nearly destroyed her career, the manipulation that had left her questioning her own worth for years. When she finished, Daniel reached across the table, his fingers curling gently around hers. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "that you carried this alone for so long." Riley swallowed hard, her throat aching. "I thought I had made peace with it," she said. "But now—" Daniel squeezed her hand. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "You don't have to forgive him. You don't even have to see him again. But whatever you choose, you're not alone." For the first time in hours, the tightness in her chest loosened slightly. That night, she lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, her mind a storm of memories and questions. She thought of the years she had spent rebuilding her life, the trust she had learned to give again, the love she had found despite everything. And she thought of Nicholas, lying in that sterile hospice bed, dying with the weight of regret pressing down on him. The next morning, she made her decision. She returned to the hospice, walking the now familiar corridor with heavy steps. Nicholas looked worse than before, his skin pale and waxy, his breathing shallow. When he opened his eyes and saw her, surprise flickered across his face. "I thought you wouldn't come back," he said, his voice rasping. Riley sat down beside him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I have questions," she said quietly, "and I want answers." Nicholas nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. She asked him everything, the details of Catherine's threats, how she had managed to fabricate evidence, how Nicholas's family had pressured him to end their relationship. Each answer cut deeper, each piece of the puzzle revealing just how much had been orchestrated behind the scenes. But the worst came at the end. "She wasn't pregnant," Nicholas said finally. "It was all a lie." Riley felt the air leave her lungs, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. "She ruined everything," she whispered. Nicholas nodded weakly. "I let her," he said quietly. "That's on me." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the truth pressing down on them both. When Riley finally stood to leave, Nicholas looked up at her, his eyes hollow and pleading. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I needed you to know." Riley paused in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. "You should have told me years ago," she said quietly. "You should have let me fight for myself." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. As she walked away, the burden she had carried for so long felt heavier than ever. But now she finally understood why. The days after her second visit to the hospice unfolded in strange, colorless shapes, as if the world had been stripped of all sharp edges and left her drifting somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. Riley moved through them mechanically, going through the motions of work, conversation, and wedding preparations without fully inhabiting any of them. The truth Nicholas had laid bare sat inside her like an unwanted guest, heavy and uninvited, stealing the air from every room she walked into. She wanted to forget, to turn her back on the hollow man in that sterile room and the tangled wreckage he had left behind years ago. She had built a life far from that day, hadn't she? A home filled with laughter and love, a partner who stood beside her without conditions or shadows. She told herself that she didn't owe the past anything, but it clung to her all the same. Each night, she lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the dark ceiling while his breath rose and fell steadily beside her. She watched the faint patterns of light dance across the bedroom walls, and when she finally drifted into restless sleep, her dreams were always the same. A cold marble floor littered with broken glass, Nicholas's voice whispering apologies that never seemed to end. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Tamara called her. Riley almost let it go to voicemail, but something in her gut urged her to answer. "You sound like hell," Tamara said without preamble. Riley offered a brittle smile, even though Tamara couldn't see it. "Thanks." There was a pause on the other end, the weight of years of friendship hanging in the silence. "You need to talk about it," Tamara said quietly, "before it eats you alive." "I've talked about it," Riley replied, her voice thin. "I've heard everything there is to hear." "That's not the same as saying it out loud," Tamara said. "You're carrying this alone." Riley didn't answer, but the words followed her long after the call ended. The next morning, she found herself standing outside her parents' house, unsure how she had ended up there. She hadn't told them about the letter, the visit, the truth. She hadn't wanted to reopen wounds that had taken them so long to heal. Her mother opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to concern in an instant. "Baby?" she said, reaching out instinctively. "What's wrong?" Riley stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and lavender washing over her like a wave. She sat at the kitchen table, her mother moving around her in practiced motions, pouring coffee, setting out a plate, sitting across from her without asking anything. When the silence became unbearable, Riley spoke. She told her everything. Her mother listened without interrupting, her face unreadable as Riley unraveled years of buried pain and fresh revelations. When she finished, her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Oh, baby," she said softly, "you've been carrying this by yourself for so long." Riley swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I thought I had moved past it." Her mother's gaze softened. "You moved forward, but that's not the same as letting it go." The words settled inside Riley, uncomfortable and true. Later that night, when she returned home, Daniel was waiting for her in the living room, a stack of wedding invitations spread out on the coffee table. He looked up as she entered, something unreadable in his eyes. "I talked to Tamara," he said quietly. Riley stiffened, her body tensing automatically. "She's worried about you," he continued. "I am too." Riley crossed the room slowly, sitting beside him. "I don't know how to make this stop," she said finally, her voice breaking. Daniel reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles across her knuckles. "You don't have to," he said gently, "but you need to decide if you want to keep carrying it." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the conversation stretching between them. Finally, Riley spoke. "I need to see him again." Daniel didn't flinch, didn't pull away. "I thought you might," he said simply. The following afternoon she returned to the hospice. The halls felt smaller this time, the walls closer. Nicholas's room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fading flowers. He looked worse than before, his skin sallow, his breathing shallow. When she entered, his eyes flickered open, surprise flashing across his face. "You came back," he rasped. Riley sat down beside him, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Nicholas nodded, his gaze heavy. "I wanted to protect you," he said, "but I see now that I destroyed you instead." Riley's throat tightened, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why didn't you fight?" Nicholas swallowed, his breath ragged. "I was weak," he said simply. "I let them convince me that the best thing I could do was disappear." The admission sat between them, heavy and undeniable. Riley stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to," Nicholas replied, "but I needed you to know." She left the hospice without looking back, the weight of the truth pressing against her chest. That night, she sat beside Daniel in the quiet of their living room, her fingers tangled in his. "I want to forgive him," she said softly, "but I don't know how." Daniel kissed her knuckles gently. "You forgive for yourself," he said, "not for him." The days that followed were quiet, filled with small moments that anchored her. Coffee in the morning, Marcus's laughter echoing down the hall, Daniel's steady presence beside her. One afternoon, while cleaning out a box of old papers in preparation for the wedding, Riley stumbled across a photo she had forgotten existed. It was from that day, the day everything had fallen apart. She stood in the center of the frame, her dress pristine, her smile bright and hopeful. She stared at it for a long time before setting it aside. Later that evening, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, the photo in her hands. She studied the woman in the picture, the woman who had once believed in forever. And then she let the photo fall into the trash. The next morning, she made one last visit to the hospice. Nicholas was asleep when she arrived, his chest rising and falling shallowly. She sat beside him for a long time, her hand resting lightly on his. When he finally opened his eyes, she smiled faintly. "I forgive you," she said quietly. His eyes fluttered closed again, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. And with that, she left. Outside, the spring air felt lighter somehow, the weight she had carried for so long finally loosening its grip. Riley walked to her car, the sun warm on her skin, the future stretching wide and waiting before her. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and quiet, the kind of soft, golden morning that seemed made for new beginnings. Riley stood by the window of the small cottage they had rented for the weekend, her bare feet pressed against the cool wood floor, her eyes tracing the faint outlines of sunlight creeping over the horizon. In the distance, she could hear the gentle rustle of leaves, the faint murmur of waves brushing against the shore. Everything about the day felt still and calm, in stark contrast to the turmoil that had defined so much of her life. The days since her last visit to the hospice had unfolded gently, like pages turning slowly in a book she hadn't realized she was ready to finish. Nicholas had passed quietly 2 days after she told him she forgave him. The nurse had called her late in the evening, her voice soft and careful, letting her know he had slipped away in his sleep. There had been no last words, no grand declarations, just a quiet ending to a story that had once nearly destroyed her. She hadn't cried when the call came. There had been a weight in her chest, yes, a familiar ache, but it was not grief in the way she had once known it. It was something softer, lighter. The sharp edges of the past had finally dulled. Daniel had sat with her that night, his hand resting gently over hers as they sat in silence. He hadn't asked questions, hadn't pressed. He had simply been there, the way he always was. The next morning, she had gone for a walk by herself, letting the cool morning air fill her lungs, her steps slow and deliberate. She thought about the man Nicholas had been, about the man he had become. She thought about the years she had lost, the nights spent wondering what she had done to deserve that kind of betrayal. And for the first time, she let it all go. The funeral had been small, almost clinical, attended only by a few distant relatives and 1 or 2 former colleagues. Riley hadn't gone. She had written a short letter instead, one she hadn't shown to anyone, folded neatly and tucked into the pocket of the jacket Nicholas had been buried in. She hadn't needed to say goodbye in a church or at a graveside. She had said goodbye long before that. Now, as she stood in the soft light of morning, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps, the gentle click of the door opening. "You're up early," Daniel said quietly, his voice still rough with sleep. Riley glanced over her shoulder, offering him a small smile. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. He crossed the room to stand beside her, his hand sliding naturally into hers. "Nervous?" Riley shook her head slowly, surprising herself with the truth. "No," she said softly. "Not nervous, just ready." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the light grow stronger, the day unfolding around them like a promise. The ceremony was exactly what she had wanted it to be: small, intimate, honest. No elaborate decorations, no formal procession, just their closest friends and family gathered in the garden of an old inn by the sea, the scent of salt and wildflowers heavy in the air. Tamara stood beside her, her smile bright and unwavering. Marcus fidgeted at Daniel's side, dressed awkwardly in a suit, his hair slicked back in a way that made him look far too grown up. Riley's parents sat in the front row, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her father's arm resting protectively around her shoulders. As she walked down the short aisle, her eyes locked on Daniel's, and in that moment, everything else fell away. There were no ghosts hovering at the edges of her vision, no echoes of shattered glass or broken vows. There was only him, standing there with his quiet, steady love. The vows they exchanged were simple and unadorned, free of the grand promises that had once felt so fragile. They spoke of partnership, of respect, of the choice to build something lasting out of the pieces of the lives they had lived before. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel leaned in and kissed her gently, his hand warm against her cheek. Later, at the small reception that followed, Riley stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching as Marcus spun awkwardly with one of the younger guests, his laughter bright and uninhibited. Her mother approached quietly, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "You look happy," her mother said softly. Riley smiled, the expression settling easily on her face. "I am," she replied. She meant it. It was only later, when the sun began to dip below the horizon and the last of the guests had wandered off toward the inn, that she allowed herself one last glance backward. She stepped away from the others, moving toward the edge of the garden where the sea stretched out before her, endless and quiet. The breeze tugged at her hair, cool and gentle. Riley closed her eyes, letting the wind wash over her, the scent of salt and flowers filling her lungs. She thought of Nicholas one last time. Not the man who had left her, not the man who had broken her heart, but the boy she had once loved, the one who had stood beside her on a day filled with light and promises. She wished him peace. And then she let him go. When she turned back toward the inn, Daniel was waiting for her, his hand outstretched, a question in his eyes. Without hesitation, Riley walked toward him, her fingers slipping naturally into his. Behind her, the past lay quiet and still. Ahead of her stretched something new, something wholly her own. For the first time in years, she felt free. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel for more powerful stories, and if this one resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.